Our security services and police will go further still to protect us against the profound challenges of terrorism, organized crime, cyber attacks.
In this video, we're going to walk through one of the most emotional moments in British royal history, a night that changed everything. We'll reveal what really happened behind closed doors when the King's health took a devastating turn, how Prince William stepped up when his family needed him most, and what this means for the future of the monarchy. So, if you want to understand the human side of the crown and witness how duty meets heartbreak, make sure you hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end. Because this story will show you that even the most powerful families face the same fears we all do. It all began in the early hours of a cold October morning. The date was October 25th, 2025, and something terrible was unfolding. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, the palace sent out a message that made the entire country freeze. The message was short, just a few words, but those words carried enormous weight. It said that the King's health had gotten much worse, and that doctors were watching him closely every single minute. Within seconds, these words traveled everywhere. They appeared on phones, on television screens, on radios, and in the hearts of millions of people who still cared deeply about the royal family. As the sun came up that morning, news reporters rushed to Buckingham Palace. You could see their breath in the chilly October air. They spoke quietly, almost in whispers. Nobody wanted to say the words out loud, but everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just another doctor's visit. The King's condition had become so serious that he might not recover. Behind the tall gates of the palace, Queen Camilla sat next to her husband at a place called Sandringham House. She refused to leave the room, even when the doctors came in to give her updates that were hard to hear. For many months, she had watched him struggle. He was exhausted from his treatments and from the heavy responsibility of being king. But something changed the night before. His energy started fading away, and the room around him felt eerily quiet and still. Now, everyone in Britain was asking the same terrifying question. What would happen if the king didn't wake up? In London, important government officials called the Privy Council were already waiting and ready to act. The Prime Minister's office at Downing Street was preparing a special speech to keep the nation calm. And at Kensington Palace, Prince William, the man who had spent his entire life training for this very moment, was already beginning to take on his father's responsibilities. He was calm and measured, completely ready for what was coming. But this wasn't a celebration or a coronation ceremony. Not yet. This was a son getting ready to carry his father's burden before the crown had even been passed down. Standing beside William was Princess Catherine. She looked tired and pale, but she remained strong. She reminded everyone around her that Charles wasn't just the king. He was also a father, a grandfather, and a husband. Around the world, news anchors struggled to find the right words as all of London held its breath. The king was dying, and when the next morning came, everything could be different. But what actually happened inside those locked palace rooms the night before? Who made the decision to turn whispers and rumors into an official announcement? Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about power and crowns. It's about the exact moment when history pauses and takes a breath. The final hours inside Sandringham House were described by people who were there as quiet, but incredibly heavy. The king's private area of the house, which was usually filled with the soft sounds of people talking and footsteps on the marble floors, had gone completely silent. The only sound was the steady hissing noise coming from the oxygen machine helping him breathe. At 2:11 in the morning, specialist doctors from the Royal Marsden Hospital, the same doctors who had been treating Charles for months, were rushed to the estate. They came in through a side door so that the cameras outside wouldn't see them. Inside the king's room, Queen Camilla sat near the window. Her hand rested gently on top of his. People who saw her said she hadn't slept in 2 whole days. She refused to leave, even to eat. Her eyes were red from crying, and when she spoke, it was barely louder than a whisper. She told one of the nurses that her husband wanted peace, not pity. But peace felt so far away. The situation had gotten worse much faster than anyone expected. People working at the palace later revealed that Charles had been doing okay earlier in the week. He had even spent one morning reading letters, and had smiled when he saw a letter written by his grandson, Prince George. But by the evening, everything changed suddenly. One doctor reportedly said it was like watching a candle's flame slowly go out. At 3:07 in the morning, The royal household office sent a secret encrypted message to both Buckingham Palace and Downing Street. The message had a code name, Operation Continuity. This was the internal alarm system that prepared government officials and royal team members for a possible change in leadership. Within minutes, the Prime Minister was woken up and briefed over secure phone lines from the Cabinet Office headquarters. The plan was simple but sacred. They needed to preserve stability, protect the family's privacy, and prepare for what seemed inevitable. At Kensington Palace, lights began turning on across the West Wing. Prince William had been told what was happening just before 3:30 in the morning. He said nothing when he heard the news. He only nodded. One of his aides later said that William had always been calm under pressure, but that night, his silence said everything. Catherine joined him moments later. She was barefoot, wearing her robe, and her face was pale. She asked him if it was really happening. He didn't answer her question because he didn't need to. They both already knew. By the time the sun started to rise, a private airplane was standing ready at RAF Northolt, prepared to take William to Norfolk. But he hesitated before leaving. He said quietly that if he left now, he wouldn't come back the same person. Catherine placed her hand gently on his arm and whispered that he should go, because his father wouldn't want anyone else to handle this. At 5:17 in the morning, William boarded the flight alone. The sky outside was a deep, colorless blue. That strange, heavy shade you see just before sunrise when it feels like the whole world is holding its breath. When his plane landed at Sandringham Airfield, a car took him to the estate. The car moved without any escort, and its headlights were dimmed. In that moment, the son who would one day be king wasn't thinking about duty or crowns. He was thinking about his father, the man who taught him that being a king doesn't start with power. It starts with endurance. And behind the guarded walls of Sandringham, endurance was all that remained. When Prince William arrived at Sandringham House just before the sun came up, the air felt unnervingly still. A light mist rolled over the gardens, wrapping the entire estate in silence. Inside there was a mix of smells, the sharp scent of antiseptic from medical equipment, and the warm smell of candle wax. It was the unmistakable combination of medicine and mourning. For a brief moment, as William stood in the corridor outside his father's room, he hesitated. For 43 years, every step he had taken in life had been moving toward this moment. But now that it was actually here, he wished it hadn't come so soon. Queen Camilla greeted him with red, swollen eyes and a voice softened by complete exhaustion. She whispered that Charles had been asking for him. William nodded and slowly removed his gloves. His mother's ring, the one he had given to Catherine, caught a bit of light from the hallway. It was a small reminder that love, not bloodline, had always been at the heart of his family's story. When William walked into the room, Charles looked frail but aware. The king's eyes flickered open, and a faint smile crossed his lips. He murmured that William had made good time getting there. William knelt down beside the bed. He said quietly that his father had once told him that the hardest part of being a king wasn't leading the country. It was leading your family. Charles gave a weak laugh and asked if William had listened to that advice. William nodded and said he remembered every word. It was one of their last private moments together, a conversation carried in whispers, interrupted only by the sound of medical monitors beeping and muffled footsteps outside the door. Camilla watched from a distance. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she held them back. She understood that this wasn't her moment to speak. It belonged to father and son, to history quietly changing hands. At 8:45 in the morning, William stepped into the study where advisors and doctors were gathered. He was calm and composed, the perfect example of his years of training. His private secretary briefed him on what needed to happen next: communication plans, coordination with the Privy Council, and protocols involving the Church of England. The young prince nodded, his face unreadable. But beneath that calm exterior, he was carrying an unbearable truth. He was now the acting head of the royal household, even though his father was still breathing. Downstairs, Catherine had arrived with Princess Anne. The two women didn't say much to each other. Their shared restraint was a reflection of royal training. Emotion is felt but never displayed. Catherine walked straight to William and gently touched his arm. She said softly that Charles had asked for music, something from his childhood. William nodded and chose a piece called Elgar's Nimrod, the same music that had been played at Queen Elizabeth's funeral. As the music played through the small speakers beside the bed, tears silently slid down Camilla's cheek. Outside, the world was waking up to uncertainty. The palace gates were surrounded by cameras and reporters. Social media was burning with speculation. People were asking if the king was dying, if William would take the crown early, and if Operation London Bridge, the plan for when the monarch dies, had been changed. The internet was drowning in rumors, but inside Sandringham, the family was living minute by minute, not as royals, but as humans watching time slip through trembling hands. By 10 in the morning, William had taken his first official step toward the transition. A secure phone line connected him with Downing Street, where the Prime Minister had been briefed overnight. An aide said that the nation was ready to support him. The word "Sir" hung heavy in the air, heavier than any crown. William answered quietly, asking them not to rush history. Back in London, Kensington Palace released a short message at 10:20. It said that the Prince of Wales had arrived at Sandringham to be with the king, and that the family requested privacy and continued prayers. Catherine personally reviewed the wording before it was sent. She knew that every sentence mattered now. Every comma would be analyzed by the entire world. She instructed the staff to use less grandeur and more grace. It was a phrase she often used, and it became the tone of the monarchy's message that day. For all his composure, William was still a son dealing with grief. In one unguarded moment, as he stood by the window overlooking the lawns his father loved, he whispered to Catherine that his father had waited 70 years to wear the crown, and only got 2. Catherine didn't reply with words. She simply took his hand. The silence between them spoke louder than any prayer could. By midday, the Archbishop of Canterbury had arrived to bless the king. Journalists noticed the black cars pulling into Sandringham and began broadcasting live. All of Britain collectively understood what those cars meant. The nation was entering that grey space between reigns, where one life fades as another rises. And yet inside that quiet Norfolk estate, amid medical charts and trembling candles, William wasn't thinking about destiny or duty. He was thinking about a promise made long ago, to lead not with authority, but with compassion, to be the kind of king his father always wanted to be. He wasn't ready for the crown, but he was ready for the call. And in the House of Windsor, that has always been enough. The clock at Sandringham House ticked softly, marking each second as if counting down something sacred. In the East Wing, where the king's private quarters were hidden behind heavy oak doors, the air was so still, it almost refused to move. Queen Camilla hadn't left the room for more than a few minutes since the previous night. Aides brought her tea that she never touched, and food she never ate. Her gaze rarely drifted from the man in the bed. The man who was once so commanding and full of conviction, and now looked painfully small beneath the soft hospital linen. At 11 in the morning, a new team of doctors from the Royal Marsden quietly entered for another examination. Camilla stood up but said nothing, watching as they checked the monitors and whispered in coded medical terms. She knew every word they were avoiding saying. The faint tremor in the chief physician's hand said more than any sentence could. From the next room, faint classical music played. It was Elgar's Nimrod, the piece William had chosen earlier that morning. It filled the air like a prayer. For Camilla, it wasn't just music. It was a requiem she had been dreading for months. She walked slowly to the window. Her reflection merged with the view of the gardens outside. The same lawns where Charles had once walked with his grandchildren, laughing freely, were now empty. A light drizzle had begun, the kind of rain that seems to weep for you when you've run out of tears yourself. In a small chair beside the fireplace sat Princess Anne. Her posture was straight, and her hands were folded neatly. She had arrived to oversee the schedule, making sure that clergy, courtiers, and legal staff were all kept discreetly out of the public eye. Anne had always been the iron spine of the family, practical, loyal, and unflinching. But even she looked weary now. She asked quietly if Charles had eaten anything. Camilla replied that he hadn't eaten since dawn, and that he was beyond appetite. A long pause filled the room. Anne adjusted the clock on the mantel, her eyes never leaving it. She suggested that Camilla should rest. Camilla shook her head and said that rest would come when the noise ended. Right now, there was still noise, even in the silence. The two women shared a look, the kind forged not from affection, but from mutual understanding. They were both veterans of a system that demanded restraint when the world expected heartbreak. Elsewhere in the house, Prince William had begun coordinating with senior courtiers. Operation Continuity, the private protocol ensuring an unbroken chain of governance, was now active. Its purpose wasn't to replace the king, but to prepare for the inevitable, the seamless moment when one era fades into another. Each message sent and each phone call placed felt like a quiet rehearsal for history. Meanwhile, in London, the Cabinet Office and Privy Council were on standby. Prime Minister Keir Starmer had been briefed again at 10 Downing Street. An advisor reported that the palace was steady, but the situation was grave. Starmer nodded solemnly and said that the country must be steady too. Back in Sandringham, Catherine sat with the children in another wing. Prince George had started asking questions no one wanted to answer. He whispered, asking when Grandpa would wake up. Catherine held him close, hiding her trembling voice. She told him that his grandpa was very tired and that sometimes people rest longer than we expect. Camilla knew that conversation would come for her too. She had rehearsed it in her mind, the words she would say to the children, to the nation, even to the cameras, but she hadn't rehearsed how it would actually feel. Her strength was a performance the world had come to admire. Yet behind that calm exterior, she was unraveling. At noon, she excused the doctors and asked for privacy. Only Anne remained. The Queen walked to the bedside and touched her husband's face lightly. She whispered that he had said he wanted to plant again in the spring, so he would have to stay for that. She said she wouldn't have him leaving her to dig alone. Anne looked away, blinking hard. Even for her, this was too intimate to witness. Moments later, a soft knock interrupted them. It was an aide carrying a sealed document that would need William's signature, an administrative formality tied to Regency provisions in case the king became unable to carry out his duties. Camilla took one look at the envelope and exhaled sharply. She asked if it was already time for that, her voice trembling. Anna nodded and said that the law doesn't wait for grief. Camilla took the document in both hands, staring at the royal crest embossed in gold. It was the cruelest kind of mercy, the monarchy's way of reminding her that personal sorrow must always kneel before duty. She said firmly that she would deliver it herself, because Charles deserved at least that dignity. And so she did. Crossing the dim corridor toward William's temporary study, Camilla carried the letter like it weighed 1,000 crowns. When she entered, William rose immediately. The room was heavy with quiet. Catherine stood in the corner, her eyes red but composed. Camilla handed him the envelope and said it was what they needed to keep the machine running, but that Charles was still his father, not a figure to replace. William nodded slowly and said he knew, but that he had to make sure that when the time came, the country wouldn't break with him. The two locked eyes, mother by marriage and son by blood, bound by a duty neither had truly chosen. It was not affection that passed between them, but an unspoken pact. When Camilla left the study, she didn't cry. She simply stopped in the hall, leaning against the wall, staring at a portrait of Queen Elizabeth. For the first time, she understood that woman's impossible loneliness. To love a man who belonged not to her, but to history. And as the clock chimed 1, echoing through the empty corridors, Camilla whispered to herself that the noise was almost over. But outside those walls, a nation was only just beginning to hear it. By early afternoon, the United Kingdom had fallen under an uneasy stillness. Television networks stopped their regular programming. The BBC's red ticker carried only one headline: Breaking, King Charles remains in critical condition. Every pub, cafe, and waiting room played the same looped broadcast from Buckingham Palace, showing the royal flag fluttering over the misty skyline of London. It felt like the entire country was holding its breath. In Downing Street, Prime Minister Keir Starmer held a small closed meeting with senior ministers. He said gravely that they must prepare for both outcomes. His voice carried the weight of centuries, every word carefully measured. Drafts of national statements were reviewed, revised, and set aside. The language was careful and the tone neutral. No one dared use the word death. The protocol called it a transition. At Westminster Abbey, bells rang once every hour, a symbol of solidarity and prayer. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, thousands of people gathered with flowers, Union Jack flags, and handwritten notes. A little girl placed a drawing that read, "Get better soon, Grandpa King." Cameras captured her mother crying beside her. It was a moment that pierced through all the noise of headlines and reminded everyone what was truly at stake. Not just a monarch, but a father, a grandfather, a man. Inside Sandringham House, the atmosphere had grown heavier. The king's doctors had stabilized him enough to allow family members brief visits. William entered first. Catherine stayed behind, watching from the doorway, as he leaned down to whisper something in his father's ear. He said softly that he would keep everything steady, and that his father should rest because the kingdom would be fine. For a moment, the king's hand twitched as if in acknowledgement. Down the hall, Princess Anne coordinated quietly with aides and clergy. Her voice remained crisp and her demeanor unwavering. She said that every procedure must be ready and that they could not stumble. For Anne, grief would have to wait. The monarchy had to look calm even when its foundations trembled. Catherine, meanwhile, carried the emotional weight that no protocol could script. She phoned the children, her voice steady even though her heart was racing. She told George and Charlotte that Grandpa was very tired, but that Daddy was with him and making sure everything was all right. The children's quiet acceptance broke her heart more than any tears could. At 2 Quasis in the afternoon, palace officials began drafting an internal statement known as the Second Notice, the coded alert that activates succession preparations without confirming a monarch's passing. Courtiers referred to it in whispers as the bridge before the bridge. It was ready, sealed, and awaiting only William's consent to send. Across the Atlantic, the story dominated global news. CNN described it as the most significant moment for Britain since the passing of Queen Elizabeth. The New York Times reported that Prince William stood on the edge of history. Even in the United States, which is normally divided on royal fascination, public sentiment was overwhelmingly compassionate. One commentator said that William wasn't just a figurehead, but a man watching his father fade in real time. Back home, the palace's communications team maintained strict discipline. Every update went through Catherine, who insisted on tone over drama. She told the staff no adjectives and no speculation. The world needed calm, not panic. It was her quiet professionalism, the same quality that once made Diana beloved, that now steadied the monarchy's image. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, a faint chant began outside the palace gates. God save the king. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was fragile, trembling, and human. Those gathered sang softly, as if afraid to tempt fate. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the Archbishop of Canterbury arrived again at Sandringham, accompanied by Lord Chamberlain Andrew Parker. Their presence meant one thing: the country was being spiritually and constitutionally prepared for what might come. Cameras caught the motorcade approaching through the rain. Londoners stopped in the streets to watch. Inside the palace, Catherine sat alone in the king's study. On the desk were neatly arranged letters, an ink pen, and a small notebook filled with Charles's handwriting. At the top of one page, she noticed a line written in careful cursive. "Legacy is not endurance, it's grace." Her eyes filled with tears. Meanwhile, in Kensington Palace, George was practicing his handwriting, copying a note his teacher helped him write. It said, "Love you, Grandpa." The innocence of his words, just 4 simple words, carried more strength than any royal decree ever could. As dusk fell, television presenters lowered their voices. The palace had issued no new statement, and that silence spoke louder than any announcement could. Across the Commonwealth, from Canada to New Zealand, flags were lowered to half-mast in sympathy. The nation waited, breath caught between dusk and destiny. For the first time since the passing of Queen Elizabeth, Britain once again felt suspended between what was and what would be. A king who had fought his whole life to serve was slipping away, and a son who never sought the crown was standing in its shadow, prepared, not eager, but ready nonetheless. And as the bells tolled once more across Westminster, the sound echoed through every home and heart. The kingdom was waiting, but time was already moving. By the evening of October 25th, 2025, Britain had entered what insiders called a soft regency, the quiet, unspoken transition, where the next generation begins to act while the old still lives. There was no proclamation and no fanfare, just a subtle shift of authority from father to son. The palace hadn't announced it, but those within its walls could feel it, in the way people paused before saying His Majesty, in the way instructions now came signed with a simple WW. At Kensington Palace, aides gathered in the Royal Situation Room, the same oak-paneled chamber where William had once planned his environmental campaigns. Tonight, those screens no longer showed tree projects or charity plans. They displayed briefings from Downing Street, private memos from the Privy Council, and contingency communications marked Operation Continuity. Active. The documents were routine, but the moment was not. William stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up and tie loosened. Around him, his advisors waited for direction. He said firmly that they were not replacing his father, but holding things steady until he could stand again. Deep down, William knew the chance of that was slim, but hope, like duty, was something he refused to abandon. Catherine entered quietly with a folder of handwritten notes. She said these were the condolence protocols, and that if things changed, they would need statements ready within minutes. William exhaled, rubbing his forehead. He murmured that his father hated the idea of rehearsing endings. Catherine met his eyes and said then they should make sure to honor his beginnings. At Buckingham Palace, the royal press team, under Catherine's direction, continued to issue updates that balanced truth with calm. The latest read that His Majesty remained under careful supervision. The phrasing was deliberate, neither false optimism nor despair. It was Catherine's mastery to comfort a nation without promising miracles. Meanwhile, Princess Anne had returned to London to oversee logistics. Aides described her as the metronome, steady, precise, and never missing a beat. Every schedule, vehicle route, and ceremonial plan ran through her. Though she stayed far from cameras, her presence ensured that nothing slipped through the cracks. In Sandringham, the king's breathing grew shallower as doctors moved quietly in and out of the room. Camilla never left his side. When a nurse suggested she rest, she shook her head. She whispered that Charles had given his whole life to the crown, and that the least she could do was give him her time. That night, Prince Harry landed in London on a private flight from Los Angeles. There were no cameras and no public statements, just a car waiting at Heathrow and a single escort to Norfolk. A palace aide later confirmed that Harry just wanted to see his father. When he arrived at Sandringham, William was waiting for him in the dimly lit corridor outside their father's room. Neither spoke for several seconds. The tension of years hung between them, the kind that words alone could not mend. Finally, Harry broke the silence and asked how Charles was. William's answer was simple. He's still here. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to peace. The two brothers stood side by side in silence, watching the door that separated them from the man who had defined their lives. Behind that door, the king's heartbeat was weak but steady, a metronome echoing through both their childhood memories and their futures. At 9 bold in the evening, a soft rain began to fall over London. Across the country, candles flickered in windows, symbols of unity, prayer, and quiet fear. In pubs, strangers whispered updates between sips of ale. In nursing homes, older Britons clasped hands and murmured blessings for the monarch they had watched grow from prince to king. The palace did not sleep that night. Every corridor glowed with a dull amber light, as if the walls themselves were keeping vigil. William and Catherine remained awake in a small anteroom beside the king's suite. William sat forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He said quietly that his father had once told him that every crown weighs differently, and that maybe his started tonight. Catherine leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. She said to let it rest easy, not on his shoulders, but on his heart. Outside, storm clouds thickened, swallowing the moon. And within the walls of Sandringham, the last of the House of Windsor's long night began. The moment between what is and what must be. By dawn on October 26th, the United Kingdom awoke beneath grey skies and a quiet no one could quite explain. The palace had not yet released a statement, but the mood across the nation said everything. The transition had already begun, not through ceremony or trumpet, but through a collective understanding that history was shifting again. From the Times to the Guardian, headlines carried the same tone. Britain prepares for a future without its king. The BBC played a solemn orchestral arrangement before the morning news, a tradition reserved for moments of national gravity. The nation's heart had slowed to the same uncertain rhythm as Charles's fading pulse. In Downing Street, Prime Minister Keir Starmer addressed reporters with the steady cadence of a man balancing empathy and duty. He said that they were a country built on continuity, and that in that continuity, they honored both service and change. Across the Atlantic, President Joe Biden released a statement calling Charles a lifelong champion for the planet and a dignified bridge between generations. French President Emmanuel Macron described him simply as the last romantic monarch. Back at Sandringham, William stood by the same window where his father had once written speeches to rally the nation. Catherine joined him, her hand resting lightly on his back. Neither spoke for several minutes. The room was filled only with the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that felt like both farewell and beginning. When Charles's condition stabilized slightly later that morning, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. It wasn't recovery, but it was a moment of grace. For William, it meant time, a final chance to be a son before he became a sovereign. For Catherine, it meant strength, the quiet understanding that history doesn't wait, even for love. Yet amid the grief and grandeur, there was something profoundly human about what Britain had witnessed. The monarchy, so often seen as distant, had revealed its most fragile truth, that even crowns tremble. And perhaps that's the lesson this generation needed, that leadership isn't about invincibility, but endurance. Charles's reign, though brief, reminded the world that tradition can evolve without losing its soul. His legacy wasn't written in decrees or ceremonies, but in quieter acts. A handshake with farmers, a speech about the climate, a father's hand resting on his son's shoulder. As one commentator on Sky News put it, for the first time, the British crown feels less like an institution and more like a heartbeat. And that heartbeat, though slowing, continues through William and Catherine, the embodiment of steadiness in a world that rarely stands still. To me, this moment feels like more than royal history. It's a mirror showing that even the highest titles bow to time, and that duty, when carried with grace, can turn mortality into meaning. And perhaps that's why millions across the world tuned in, not just to witness a chapter of the monarchy, but to remember that behind every title, there's a human story of love, loss, and legacy. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What does leadership mean to you in an age where even kings must yield to time? Share your opinions in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this reveal the heart behind the crown, make sure to like this video, leave your reflections, and subscribe for more insights and emotional narratives from behind the palace gates. Because in the end, history is written not only by power, but by compassion. And sometimes the quietest moments speak the loudest to the world. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.